It was the kind of quiet that feels wrong. The kind that settles over a neighborhood when something has broken the natural rhythm of things. On a crisp autumn evening, under the dim glow of streetlights, a single house on a manicured street held a silence that was heavier than any sound. This wasn't just an empty home. It was a place where a story had ended. A story of love, family, and a betrayal so deep it defied understanding. Inside that house, a terrible secret had been kept. And now, that secret had claimed everything. Two women, a mother and a daughter, were gone. And a man was left standing in the ruins of a life he had built and then destroyed. The story really begins not with an ending, but with what looked like a perfect beginning. It was a tale of an ordinary family living an ordinary life. Or so it seemed to the outside world. Neighbors saw backyard barbecues. They saw holiday decorations go up on time. They saw a happy couple, a loving family. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. A story of hidden desires and broken trust. It was a drama playing out in whispered phone calls and stolen moments. A betrayal that cut deeper than a knife because it came from within the sacred circle of family. A man, a wife, and her own mother. How does something like this happen? That's the question everyone started asking. How does a bond between a mother and her daughter get so twisted? How does a husband's promise become so worthless? The answers are never simple. They are found in the small compromises, the tiny lies that grow over time. They are found in the quiet resentments and the unspoken needs that fester in the dark. In this case, it started with a glance, a shared moment that should have meant nothing. But it grew into something monstrous, something that would eventually consume them all in its unholy fire. And so, we are left to sift through the ashes, to look back at the pieces of this shattered family and try to make sense of the senseless. The police would have their theories. The town would have its whispers. But the truth? The truth was buried with the two women who paid the ultimate price. A mother and a daughter, bound by blood and torn apart by a devastating secret. Their story serves as a chilling reminder, a warning that some lines should never be crossed, and some secrets, once let out, can never be put back in their box. They just burn everything down. Mark was the kind of man everyone liked. He had a firm handshake, an easy smile, and a good job in the city. He was what you'd call a good provider, a steady presence. He had met Sarah in college, and their story was one for the books. They were the couple everyone rooted for. Sarah was bright, full of life, with a laugh that could fill a room. She was an artist, a painter who saw the world in vibrant colors. They bought a house, planted a garden, and seemed to have it all. From the outside, their life was a painting of domestic bliss, carefully crafted and beautiful to behold. Sarah was incredibly close to her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor was a widow, a striking woman who had retained her elegance and charm. She lived just a town over and was a constant presence in their lives. She'd come for dinner on Sundays, help Sarah in the garden, and dote on her daughter as if she were still a little girl. The bond between them was fierce, a powerful cord of mother-daughter love that everyone admired. Eleanor had raised Sarah on her own after her husband passed away, and their connection seemed unbreakable. She wasn't just a mother. She was Sarah's best friend, her confidant. Mark and Eleanor also had a warm relationship, or so it appeared. He was the son-in-law every mother hopes for. He treated her with respect, listened to her stories, and fixed things around her house without being asked. They would often share a laugh at Sarah's expense, a gentle, loving kind of teasing. To any observer, they were the perfect trio. A happy couple and a supportive mother, all woven together in a tight-knit family fabric. They were the picture of stability, the kind of family you'd see in a commercial for life insurance or a family sedan. But pictures can be deceiving. They only show you the surface, the carefully posed smiles. They don't show you what happens when the camera is put away. They don't capture the subtle shifts in a glance, the unspoken tensions, or the secrets that begin to grow in the quiet spaces between people. In this perfect picture, a crack was beginning to form. It was almost invisible at first, a hairline fracture in the foundation. But it was there, threatening to bring the entire beautiful structure crashing down to the ground. No one saw it coming, especially not Sarah. The affair didn't start with a crash of thunder. It began with a whisper. It started during a summer when Sarah had to travel for work for a few weeks. Eleanor came to stay at the house, to keep Mark company, to water the plants. The evenings grew long. They would share a bottle of wine on the patio, talking late into the night. The conversation started innocently enough. They talked about Sarah, about their day, about memories, but slowly the topics shifted. They became more personal. Eleanor spoke of her loneliness as a widow. Mark spoke of the pressures of his job, the feeling that something was missing. They were small confessions, spoken in the safety of the dark, but they built a bridge between them. A bridge that should never have been built. One night, a hand lingered too long on an arm. A look was held for a moment too long. It was a silent agreement, a crossing of a line that they both knew was there. It was a betrayal of the highest order against the one person they were both supposed to love and protect above all others. The affair was born not of passion, but of a shared emptiness. It was a quiet, desperate, and ugly thing. Hiding it was a complicated dance. It was a web of careful lies and half-truths. Phone calls were made when Sarah was in the shower. Text messages were deleted immediately. Eleanor's visits became more frequent, but always under a plausible excuse. She was dropping off groceries. She was helping with a leaky faucet. Every act of kindness became a potential cover for their secret. The guilt was a constant heavy weight. For Mark, every kiss he gave his wife felt like a lie. For Eleanor, every hug she gave her daughter felt like a stab in the back. The tension in the house became a living thing. It was a fourth presence at the dinner table. Sarah could feel it, even if she couldn't name it. She noticed the quiet between her husband and her mother. She saw the way they avoided each other's eyes. She put it down to stress, to a bad mood, to anything but the truth. Because the truth was simply unthinkable. It was a possibility that her mind refused to entertain. The secret was safe for now, festering in the shadows of their perfect life, poisoning everything it touched. The truth has a way of coming out. It doesn't matter how carefully you hide it, it finds a crack and seeps through. For Mark and Eleanor, the crack was a phone bill. A simple, mundane piece of paper left on the kitchen counter. Sarah was paying bills one afternoon when she noticed the number, her mother's number. It was listed over and over again on Mark's bill. Dozens of calls, many late at night, some lasting for over an hour. It didn't make sense. Why would her husband be talking to her mother so much so late? They lived in the same house for many of those calls. A cold seed of suspicion was planted. Sarah started looking. She felt like a trespasser in her own life, her hands shaking as she went through Mark's phone while he slept. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew something was wrong. And then she found them. The messages. Not just a few, but hundreds. They weren't just friendly texts. They were intimate. They were filled with words of affection, with plans to meet, with references to moments they had shared. And they were between her husband and her mother. The world stopped. The air left her lungs. The confrontation was not a screaming match. It was worse. It was a chilling, deathly quiet. Sarah sat them both down in the living room, the place where they had shared so many family moments. She placed the phone on the coffee table between them. She didn't have to say a word. The look on her face, a mixture of profound heartbreak and disbelief, said everything. Mark's face went pale. He started to stammer, to deny, but the words died in his throat. Eleanor just sat there, frozen, her face a mask of shame. She couldn't even look at her daughter. The silence was finally broken by a single, whispered word from Sarah. Why? It was a question that hung in the air, unanswered. How could they do this to her? Her husband, the man she had built a life with, and her mother, the woman who had given her life. The betrayal was absolute, a double-edged sword that had severed the two most important relationships in her life. The perfect picture was shattered. The beautiful painting was slashed to ribbons. All that was left was the ugly, raw, and devastating truth. The room was filled with the sound of a heart breaking. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The house, once a home, became a pressure cooker of unspoken rage and unbearable sorrow. Mark moved into the guest room. The silence was his constant companion. Every creak of the floorboards, every closing door, felt like an accusation. He tried to speak to Sarah, to apologize, to explain, but his words were useless. They were just empty sounds against the wall of her pain. She looked at him, but she didn't see him anymore. She saw a stranger, a monster who had destroyed her world. He was trapped in the wreckage he had created, with no way out. Sarah was a ghost in her own home. She moved from room to room, her face pale and drawn. The vibrant colors she once painted with were gone, replaced by a bleak, gray fog of grief. She didn't eat, she didn't sleep. She would just sit for hours, staring at nothing. The betrayal had hollowed her out. It wasn't just the infidelity, it was the collusion. The two people she trusted most in the world had conspired against her. Her mother. The thought was a relentless torment. How could she? The question looped endlessly in her mind, a torture she could not escape. Eleanor was gone. She had fled the house after the confrontation, back to her own empty home. But there was no escape from what she had done. She called Sarah relentlessly, her voicemails becoming more and more frantic. They were a torrent of apologies, excuses, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. "I don't know why I did it," she cried in one message. "I was so lonely. Please, Sarah, please talk to me." But Sarah couldn't. To hear her mother's voice was to feel the betrayal all over again, a fresh stab to an open wound. The tension stretched taut over those few days. It was a wire pulled to its breaking point. Mark was caught in the middle, a pariah in his own life. He was desperate to fix what he had broken, but he had no tools to do so. Sarah was isolated in her grief, unable to turn to the one person she always had, her mother. And Eleanor was alone with her shame, cut off from the daughter who was her entire world. The air was thick with despair. Something had to give. The pressure was building, and everyone knew it. But no one could have predicted how it would all end. It was Mark who found them. After 3 days of suffocating silence from both women, a knot of dread began to tighten in his stomach. Sarah hadn't left her room. He had knocked, but there was no answer. He called Eleanor's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A primal fear, cold and sharp, finally pushed him to act. He first went to the master bedroom. He turned the knob. It was unlocked. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and on the bed, still and silent, was Sarah. His heart stopped. He knew, instantly. He knew she was gone. Panic, raw and absolute, seized him. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial 911. While he waited for the sirens, a second, more terrible thought clawed its way into his mind. Eleanor. He had to check on Eleanor. He left Sarah, a decision that would haunt him forever, and drove frantically to his mother-in-law's house. He used the spare key she had given him long ago, in a different lifetime. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He called her name. There was no answer. He found her in her own bedroom. The scene was eerily, horribly similar. She was lying in her bed, looking almost peaceful, as if she were just asleep. But she wasn't. The emptiness of the house, the stillness in the air, confirmed his worst fear. Both of them. They were both gone. The man who had, just days before, been a husband and a son-in-law, was now standing alone in a graveyard of his own making. The weight of it all crushed him. He collapsed, the sound of his own guttural sobs swallowed by the profound silence of the house. When the police arrived at the first scene, they found Mark outside, incoherent with grief and shock. It took them minutes to understand what he was trying to tell them. That it wasn't just one house. It was two. It wasn't just one body. It was two. A mother and her daughter, found dead in their own beds, just miles apart, on the same day. The news spread through the first responders like a shockwave. This wasn't a simple, tragic event. This was something else. Something far more complex and far more sinister. The investigation had begun. The police investigation immediately focused on one person, Mark. A husband who discovers his wife and mother-in-law dead on the same day? The odds were astronomical. He was the common denominator. He had the motive. A secret affair had been exposed. Was this a crime of passion? A double murder staged to look like something else? They took him in for questioning. They grilled him for hours. They searched his home, his car, his life. Mark, numb with grief, told them everything. He told them about the affair, the discovery, the fight. He laid the ugly truth bare for them to see. But as the autopsies came back, the story shifted. There were no signs of violence on either body, no struggle. The cause of death for both Sarah and Eleanor was the same. A massive overdose of prescription pills. Sleeping pills. Sarah's were from a prescription she had. Eleanor's were from an old one of her late husband's. And then came the notes. The police found one in each bedroom. Sarah's was short, a few lines of heartbreaking prose about a betrayal she could not live with. Eleanor's was longer, a rambling confession of shame and a plea for a forgiveness she felt she could never receive in this life. It was a murder-suicide of the soul, a coordinated act of despair. The public reaction was a storm of shock and morbid curiosity. The story was on every local news channel. "Tragedy of betrayal," the headlines screamed. The perfect family was now a public spectacle. Neighbors who once waved hello now whispered behind their hands. Friends who once shared dinners now shared theories. Some blamed Mark, seeing him as a moral murderer, even if he didn't physically commit the act. Others felt a strange, tragic pity for him. He was a man who had lost everything because he couldn't control his own weakness. He was a living ghost, forever haunted by the faces of the two women he had driven to their deaths. In the end, there were no arrests. There was no trial. There was just the devastating aftermath. The story serves as a somber monument to the destructive power of secrets. A lie, born in a moment of weakness, grew into a cancer that consumed an entire family. It reminds us that trust, once broken, can sometimes never be repaired, and that the consequences of betrayal can be far greater than we can ever imagine. It is a story about the terrible cost of a lie and how some debts can only be paid with life itself, leaving nothing behind but silence and regret.